Hello, welcome to peerScholar. This is one of a number of short videos. The purpose of this video is just to show you what a peerScholar activity looks like from a student perspective. So we're going to jump right into that. The first thing I want to say very quickly though is that you can use peerScholar in a standalone way, or it can be integrated with your learning management system. For the vast majority of what I'm going to show you today, the experience will be very similar. The standalone version does have you see a couple things that you would never see in the integrated version. So I'll make that clear. This is one of them, by the way. So in the standalone, people would come to app.peerscholar.com. They could register an account, etc. And they would log in, and this would bring them into their student account. I'm just going to show you the courses that they're a student in. So they would see any courses that are using peerScholar that they're a student within, and then they could click into a course. Now, if you're using the integrated version, you don't need to do any of these steps. It's single sign-on, so you would begin by going to your course shell, and then you just click into peerScholar, and where you would end up is in fact here. Okay, it knows what course you're in, it knows where the activity is. So from here on in, the two experiences are the same. Okay. What are we seeing here? Well, typically what you would see is just a single, what we call activity bar, composed of these three steps. And in a normal peerScholar activity, students first create something, they then assess the work of their peers, and they then reflect on the feedback their peers assign to their work, potentially assess that feedback, and potentially revise their work for final submission. In this case, I've just really copied this activity 3 times, and this just allows me to have all 3 phases open at once. So that's the only reason I have 3 here, just so I can demonstrate it better again. But normally it would be here, and then it would move to here, and then it would move to here. Okay, so create phase. It would normally, when people click in, they would normally first see this, and this on the foreground here are the instructions that their course instructor has provided. So these are the instructions for the create phase. Also, if the instructor attached anything like a rubric, that would be available to them. They could open that up and see that rubric there. And so basically this tells the student what you want them to do. Student reads that, says okay, and then they do it. Now, by do what? Well, they can do any digital composition. So it could be a written composition, as you have here, but it could also be, they could attach files with videos or images or sounds or whatnot. So literally you can ask them to compose anything, whatever you might normally do for your course. And they compose, and that's great. Okay, so that's basically all they do in the create phase. Things get more interesting in the assess phase. So let's just imagine now a whole class has submitted an activity. Now we come into the assess phase, and now I, as a student, see the work of a subset of my peers. This work is presented anonymously. It's selected predominantly randomly from the class, although we have a little bit of AI in our algorithms to try to increase the homogeneity of quality, or the heterogeneity of quality and such, but let's just call it random. So they see a set of random peers, and here is where we ask them to assess the work of their peers. And they do that in 2 ways. One is they can attach things right to the actual piece itself. So this is great if they want to make surface level comments, things like sentence structure, grammar, maybe citation, etc. So they can note those right on the written piece itself. But then we also have on the right here a formal assessment. And this would have been created by the instructor. It basically guides the students through their analysis of the work. And this is, of course, where they're engaging in all of this critical thinking, you know, especially if you have a bunch of tools. You could ask them, you know, what grade would you give it? This is something called a matrix tool. If you want to use a rubric and have them actually score the work according to a rubric, you can recreate that rubric here, and so they can actually submit scores in the rubric itself. But of course, something you should almost always do is something we have represented at the bottom here. Let me just read this. Think of all the ways this composition could be improved. Then zero in on the one thing that, if improved, would lead to the maximum overall improvement of the composition. Tell the peer what that one thing is, and then give them some sense of how to improve it. Okay, this is the kind of thing that pushes students to analyze this critically. Think about it critically. What are all the ways it could be better? Among those, what is that one thing that I think would have the most impact if this person changed? And so now I have to communicate what that thing is to the student in as clear a way as possible, and I have to give them some sense of how to fix it. So there's some creative thinking going on there. So we're really pushing students to engage all of this thought process. They do it for peer 1, they do it again for peer 2, etc., etc., etc. So they're getting this repeated, structured practice with these skills, which is very cool. Finally, you can also show them their work and ask them to assess themselves. And what you may have noticed here is the assessment form has changed a little bit. Sometimes when you're asking them to assess themselves, you want to ask them slightly different questions. So for example, this one says, highlight one thing you learned from this experience that you could work on to improve your work going forward. So you might want students to reflect on something they've learned from here, just to kind of emphasize that. So this final step here is all about metacognitive awareness, trying to enhance students' understanding of their own work. And there's a lot of research that suggests that the best time to get them to do that is after they've just assessed their peers. They're already in that sort of critical mindset, and so now teach them how to apply that even to themselves. And that's what they do in this final work. Okay, so again, in the grand scheme of things, what you're seeing here is that this asking students to assess their peers is a very powerful way to engage all of these skills, these transferable skills we want students to learn, and it gives them repeated, structured practice engaging in those skills. In this case, it's predominantly in a what I would call outward-going way, trying to help somebody else improve. Okay? We're now going to turn that around in the last step. So in the third step of the activity, let's say it this way, while I was assessing 5 students were assessing me. And so in this last step, it's about me seeing what other people said about my work and then doing certain things with that feedback. So we're teaching students how to learn from feedback. So now when I switch the peers, this is staying the same because this is actually my work. And so if I go back to peer 1, what I'm seeing here is these are the inline comments that this student applied to my work, peer 1. And then these are the ratings they gave according to these things that were specified by the instructor, including, for example, the constructive comment. So your biggest issue is the way you have organized your composition. It lacks structure. In the first paragraph, you should highlight the points you will make. Then you should have a separate paragraph that focuses on each point. Okay, so we have somebody here giving this person some feedback about how they can improve. There's sort of 3 levels you can go in this step. One is just to show students their feedback. That's okay. But another step is to actually ask them to assess this feedback. I just read this, and now it says rate feedback. And so now I can give the students some questions to have them thinking about the feedback. And this is very important to get them to learn better, to really push them to analyze the feedback well. In this specific example, what we're doing is we're trying to show the students that feedback has 2 distinct layers, if you will. There's the information this person is presenting to you to help you improve, and then there's the tone, the emotional tone of how they do that. And what we're trying to make them see is that these are 2 separate things, that somebody who says your work is great, that makes you feel good, but it's actually useless. It's not helping you at all. And that good feedback is both useful, but also presented in a way that makes the person want to listen to it, makes the person want to think about it. So we're trying to teach students about this by explicitly asking them to look at each bit of feedback and separate those 2 components, the usefulness and the emotionality that it produces. Note also that for the student who gave this feedback, they will eventually see what their peers thought about the feedback they gave. So they will learn, for example, that maybe every peer, my feedback made them angry, so maybe I should work on my tone. a little bit. Okay, so we're really working on this feedback giving and receiving thing. All right, so what we imagine now, the third step, students can go through peer by peer and assess that feedback. Now it's again critical thinking. They're thinking a lot about this, but it's critical thinking in what I call a receptive communication context. This is critical thinking about what other people think of their work. And it's kind of cool because some of these peers are right on the money, some of them not so much. And so it's really on the student to kind of think about each bit of feedback and decide whether they agree with it or not. And that's what they do as they move from peer to peer. So again, repeated structured practice with that skill. The third level that I highly recommend, if you can do it, is to also ask them to revise. Okay, they've seen all this feedback, they've thought about the feedback, and now you can literally say, okay, put it into practice. Formatively take this information you've learned and use it to make your work better. And there's a lot of research that shows that that's a very powerful, it's the most powerful way to harness feedback, that if you don't ask them to use it immediately, sometimes feedback has very little impact. But if you give them the chance to use it and make their work better, then they tend to learn the most from it. Okay, so they do that. Now, I kind of glossed over this on the other steps, but you might have noticed that sometimes there's a final step too, and that is you can, as an instructor, add questions to the end of any of these phases. So as students are done, they can be leaving and you can ask them to do something else. So in this case, I'm saying this is a justification of revisions. Please use this space to show us you thought deeply about the feedback you received. Do this by explaining how you revised your work to integrate the feedback you find useful, but especially in cases when you ignored the suggestions, provide your rationale for doing so. And so this is a place where the student can literally reflect on the changes they made or didn't make and justify them. And again, this is good critical thinking, communication, metacognition, all of this stuff going on. Okay, so in a nutshell, that is a peerScholar activity from a student perspective. You ask them to do whatever you might, whatever you find is appropriate for your class. They do that just as they always would, but then they enter into this process of giving feedback to peers and then ultimately digesting feedback given to them. As they do so, they're engaging all of these core transferable skills, exercising them in that sort of structured, repeated way that's critical for skill development. Okay, so that's the student side. Look for my next video where I do show you the steps that an instructor would go through to create an activity like this. All right, thank you very much. Bye-bye.